Bueno, buenas tardes, bienvenidos a esta sesión plenaria que se realiza en el primer día del quinto Congreso Argentino de Fitopatología. Mi nombre es Daniel Plopper y tengo el gusto de moderar esta sesión plenaria. En primer lugar, mi agradecimiento a los organizadores de este congreso por haberme designado en este rol. Esta sesión plenaria se denomina Emerging Plant Diseases When Science Meets Society, que traducido sería algo así como enfermedades vegetales emergentes, el encuentro entre la ciencia y la sociedad. Estará a cargo del doctor Rodrigo Almeida. Esta va a ser una presentación en inglés. ¿Por qué hemos querido hacer una sesión plenaria sobre este tema? Bueno, hay muchos ejemplos de las dramáticas consecuencias económicas, ambientales y sociales que traen las epifitias, o sea, las epidemias severas. Por eso, cuando aparecen enfermedades emergentes, surgen muchos temores, ya que implican desafíos únicos en términos de cuarentena, erradicación, con todos los condimentos que implican sobre riesgos e incertidumbres. Eso lo hemos visto muy bien con lo que ha sido, en el caso de la población humana, la pandemia del coronavirus. Así que, y también hemos visto en el caso del coronavirus las decisiones que deben tomar las autoridades, y muchas veces basan sus decisiones en el potencial económico y social que conlleva cada enfermedad. Así que el doctor Almeida justamente nos va a tocar este tema y la experiencia que él tiene con el síndrome de decaimiento rápido del olivo causado por Xylem fastidiosa. El doctor Rodrigo Almeida es profesor de Ecología de Enfermedades Infecciosas Emergentes y director de la División de Organismos Ambientales del Departamento de Ciencias Ambientales, Política y Manejo de la Universidad de California en Berkeley, Estados Unidos. Es docente adscripto del Museo ESSIC de Entomología. El doctor Almeida obtuvo su título de grado en la Universidad de San Pablo en el año 1997, luego obtuvo en la misma Universidad de San Pablo su maestría en entomología en 1999 y en 2002 obtuvo su doctorado, su PhD, en la Universidad de California, Berkeley, en el departamento de ecología, de ciencias ambientales, política y manejo. El doctor Almeida obtuvo numerosas distinciones a lo largo de su carrera, entre ellos la prestigiosa Lee Hutchins Award de la Sociedad Americana de Fitopatología en 2021. También obtiene la posición de Hildebrand Lohmeister Chair en el Departamento de Patología de la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Ha sido autor y coautor de numerosos trabajos, más de 120 artículos en revistas con referato, capítulos de libros, presentaciones en congreso, etc. Y también tiene entre sus áreas de interés para investigación está el tema justamente de ecología de enfermedades emergentes, biología de transmisión de patógenos, interacción de insectos y patógenos. Y uno de los sistemas que él utiliza justamente es este de Xylem fastidiosa, que nos va a mostrar hoy, y también el caso del Grapevine Leaf Roll Virus. Así que, y además se manifiesta abierto a la posibilidad de estudiar otras nuevas enfermedades emergentes. Así que el doctor Almeida tiene 30 minutos para su presentación. Yo le voy a avisar cuando le queden 5 minutos, así puede ir redondeando. Y los invito a que vayan haciendo sus preguntas, así posteriormente tenemos un intervalo, ahí un pequeño tiempo para poder contestarlas. Así que hecho esta presentación, les repito, esta va a ser una charla en inglés, so please, Dr. Almeida, go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel. I would also like to thank Ernestina for the invitation. I was very excited to go to Corrientes, but unfortunately, maybe another time in the future. I would also like to apologize for not using a Portuñol, but my Portuñol is very bad, and it makes presenting this material very challenging. So what I will try to do is try to tell a story of a very devastating emerging disease in Italy. And we tend to think of it as being unique, but I don't think it's sort of unique. And what I'll try to argue at the end is that plant pathology is a little bit self-limiting in that we try to understand diseases and manage them, but very often we fall short, and it's not because of our technical knowledge. Similar to what Danielle was saying, sometimes it's just because of politics or society, and the example he gave about COVID is a good example because, you know, in the United States, a lot of people don't want a vaccine, for example. They don't want to wear masks, and that's why we have 2,000 people dying every day. So this is one example of that, in my view, in plant pathology. Oops. So very briefly, this is a photograph of our group here at Berkeley. We were excited to be able to get together after not seeing each other for several months, and we went on a hike, and we're all masked and being socially distant, but it was, you know, nice to see everybody. Of course, our work has been funded by different agencies over time. So let me just start by saying that the topic here of today is not unique to this disease or to plant pathology or anything else. Danielle already mentioned the coronavirus pandemic, and here you have our former president essentially, you know, working to undermine science. We all know cigarettes are not good for you, but we've all heard about, you know, cigarette companies lying to the public. Climate science, of course, it's another item where you have a lot of these problems. And many of you may remember Italian scientists that essentially almost ended up in jail a few years ago because they could not predict an earthquake. So these are really examples of you know, science being undermined. And these are very popular examples, common examples, but there are many more, of course. So I know that one of the reasons I was excited to go to Argentina was because there is Xylella in Argentina, and I still have not met any of those colleagues, so I was excited to be able to talk to them. But I'll very briefly illustrate Xylella biology, just so that you know a little bit of the details. So Xylella is a xylem-limited bacterium. Essentially colonizes xylem vessels. It moves through the pit membranes, and it clogs xylem vessels. It also induces plant responses that lead to tylosis, but essentially is reducing water transport through the xylem. It is transmitted by different types of insects, xylem sap-feeding insects. In Europe, spirobugs, cercopids are the main vectors. In the Americas, the vectors are called sharpshooter leafhoppers. So those are xylem sap-feeding leafhoppers. There's no other mode of transmission. One important thing, particularly for this story in Europe, is that there is no specificity between vector and strain of Xylella or genotype of Xylella. So in Europe, what happened is you had a lot of insect vectors that were capable of transmitting the pathogen and no pathogen. And then when the pathogen showed up, you already could get transmission. So that's pretty much all I'm going to tell you about Xylella. And we're going to go right into the history of it. So Xylella, the first Xylella disease was observed in Southern California. So this is where Disneyland is in California, near Los Angeles, in the late 1800s by this guy called Newton Pierce. And he did a good study. Of course, he did not find Xylella. He thought it was a virus, but that's when it all started. And Xylella is now present in different regions of the world, or has been reported. This is not a complete figure. It's also present in Portugal. It's present in Israel and a few other places. But it's, you know, emerging as a pathogen of importance. And this is the pathogen that the story I'll be talking about is about Xylella introduced in olives into Italy and causing disease in olive trees. And these are dead olive trees. So I was on sabbatical in France, working with aphids and viruses. And I got this email here from someone who works with olives in southern Italy. And the details don't matter. What matters is that in October 2013, people were finding sick plants in southern Italy, and they were linking that, they were able to link that to Xylella. So shortly after that, a couple of weeks after I got that email, Italy reported to the European Union the presence of Xylella. And the important thing is that it was detected down here at the heel of the boot of Italy. And the important thing is that there was no Xylella in Europe. So Xylella was a quarantine reportable pathogen, and there was a big concern about it because it was an introduction. And of course, it can cause disease in many plants, including grapevines, almonds, and others that are of importance to Europe. So there was a lot of concern about this introduction. And because I was nearby, I kind of went there. So I just want to mention that every time you talk about plant disease outbreaks, there are some concerns about managing them. And the point here is that there is limited knowledge available to devise good management strategies because this is an emerging new problem. However, if you want to control it, you have to make decisions and take actions very quickly, right? So there is this problem. How can you be very decisive and quick if you are not sure what exactly you need to do? And it's an inherent problem. And we saw this again with COVID, right? It's the same problem. So I went there, and you know, all of us at some point in our careers end up in a newspaper. So here I am in the newspaper in Italy. And it was a very scary sort of trip. It was really interesting, but there was a lot of interest by the media, and there were a lot of dead trees. So I'm going to show you a video of what this looks like from a drone. So you can drive for a long time in that region, and all you see are dead trees. Okay? It's really impressive. You stop there, but I think you get the idea that, you know, you drive and it's dead trees. Okay, it's like where I grew up in São Paulo state in Brazil. You drive and there is only sugar cane. In this case, you drive and it's all dead trees. So it's a big problem because you can see there is nothing else in the landscape. These olive trees were the only thing in the landscape, and they're the source of much of the economy in the region because of tourism as well as olive oil. Many of these trees are thousands of years old. Most of them are hundreds of years old. So there's also a strong cultural connection to these plants. So when I first got there, it was interesting because in the newspapers and in the media, I was there to discuss a solution to limit the spread of the epidemic. And really, people were framing this as a solvable problem that, you know, it will require some effort, but we will take care of this. And you can see here that I'm not particularly thinking that this is a good situation. I was talking to a lot of people, and the only thing I could think of is how bad this was. But everybody else thought that, well, this is another plant disease and it will be just fine. So it was interesting that very quickly we started seeing a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and people are deliberately generating lies, essentially, alternative facts. And a lot of conspiracy theories. Again, it's a lot easier to talk about this now with the COVID because of the conspiracy theories and everything. But there were lots of protests in the region blocking any sort of management strategy. There was a book out there that was published, it was a very popular book, won an award about how it was a conspiracy theory about Xylella, essentially saying Xylella does not exist or the disease is not important. And here is the one that I find particularly interesting. So there was a website that they summarized the conspiracy theory here. And essentially they linked me to this other Rodrigo Almeida, who works in Syngenta. And you can see that we don't look exactly the same. But essentially linking me to this person and saying that I am this person. And because I work for Monsanto, I introduced Xylella to cause all the devastation. So it's interesting that these things can get very personal, and it's a really, it really affects you. It sounds like a joke right now, but it's something that really affects your ability to communicate and do your work, because people think that you're responsible for a lot of devastation. So you have all these things going on at the same time. Europe is trying to control, Italy is trying to control the epidemic. And at the same time, you have conspiracy theories coming from the other side. And you end up with a lot of experts emerging from out of nowhere. So one of the experts that was talking a lot about things that how to manage the disease at this time was an astrophysicist. So this is someone who's looking at stars. And all of a sudden, because he's a professor, he became an expert on Xylella diseases and plant pathology. But we know the difference between a physicist or a chemist and a plant pathologist, but the public does not know the difference because we are all professors, right? We are all scientists. And what that led was to Nature Journal had an article summarizing some of this, but essentially scientists were starting to be blamed for the devastation. They were blamed for either introducing the pathogen, or they were blamed for not doing their work and allowing for it to continue spreading and causing a lot of problems. And it became a serious problem. The people of the region were no longer trusting science and scientists. And what that led to, of course, is an issue, because then politicians are also not listening to the science, and that can lead to bad policy. So the policies were bad. So as all of this is happening, olives are, of course, very interesting, long-living trees. And of course, they produce olive oil. There's a lot of interest in olive trees. And this story got picked up by high-profile news outlets from BBC News, The Guardian, National Geographic, New York Times. So everyone talked about this at some point. So it became a very big issue. And some of the conflict was really related to a couple of issues. So here you have essentially Uncle Sam representing the United States. And here you have Salento, which is the region, an old olive tree. The graphics speak a lot. But essentially, there was this impression that this was all about money. It was a deliberate effort to kill olive trees so that, companies could sell pesticides or do biomass or plant transgenic crops. So that was really sort of some of the conspiracy theory. But the underlying factors were really driven by the fact that for Europe, Xylella is a quarantine pathogen, which is a big problem, and it has to be eradicated. But in the region, the olive trees live thousands of years. They're part of the local culture. They're part of the local economy. And people have a strong relationship with olive trees, a personal, social relationship, cultural relationship. So here you have Brussels in Belgium essentially telling communities in southern Italy that they have to cut their trees and that's important. So there is a friction there that was not properly addressed. So this kind of summarizes some of these different perspectives, but essentially the European Commission in Brussels was talking about one thing, about the pathogen introduction and the risks. And local activists and community members, they were really talking about, no, this is our region. These are the trees we love. We grew up with them. And we're not just going to go around cutting them. And there was a lot of friction and never became solved. And some people have put blame on scientists, plant pathologists in the region, that they didn't do a good job communicating. And I am not really sure. Maybe, but the reality is that the plant pathologists of the region were working, trying to understand what was causing the disease and how to control it. And they were doing this, working very hard under a lot of pressure. And, they didn't have time to think about how they will communicate to others. So I think that there is a question of who actually should be doing this communicating and interacting with politicians and community members. Is that the job of a plant pathologist? Maybe it is at some level, but maybe, we need more people involved. We need social scientists engaged with these issues as well. So as this story develops, so this is starting in 2013, essentially Italy has guidelines. It has to eliminate olive trees. It's very expensive. It's also probably not effective at this point, and it's politically very challenging. And other than trying to cut some trees, nothing really happened in terms of disease control. But lots of other things happened. So you can see very large protests against the management and cutting of trees and any effort to manage the epidemic. So this is stopping at a train station here on the tracks, stopping, blocking freeways, all sorts of different types of protests. These are still going on. This was a representative of the region in the European Commission. So this was the region politician that was representing the region in Europe, for Europe. And she was lying. She was essentially saying it's not a problem. We don't have an issue. We don't want to cut the trees. And she was caught lying, but clearly it does not matter for her. And there were some scary things that happened. So this is one of the scariest things as a scientist. Sorry about that. So essentially, this is a local prosecutor. So this is the person trying to put people in jail in the region. And these people investigated scientists that were working in the region. So essentially, one of the things they did is they walked into the research lab of the main group in the region on a Monday. The police walked in, took all computers from everybody, and these people did not have computers to work for 1 week. And several times they had to go and be interviewed by these individuals because these people were trying to blame them for everything and put them in jail. That got resolved years ago, but you can imagine the stress and the cost to the scientists of having to deal with this. The other thing that these people did is that they blocked any collecting of samples from the region for testing. So you can see here is the number of samples tested for Xylem to look where its spread is occurring and everything. They blocked testing. So essentially 2-3 years after the epidemic started, when it was still expanding very quickly, no samples were tested for 1 year. So people had no idea where the pathogen was and how it was spreading, which is, for a plant pathologist is really crazy. So local activists, of course, they got help from popular people. So there are some very popular local singers that were there saying that, this is not a problem. We will solve it. We should not worry about it. There are local international artists. So Helen Mirren, who's a famous British artist, she has a house, I was told, in the region, and she was there to kind of bring awareness of the problem. And while all of this is going, the plants are dying, right? So here you have a photograph of the same plant over a period of 3 years. You can see how fast the disease, this is Xylem fastidiosa. So it's a small, slow moving disease, but you can see the impact here in a couple of years. You can see more devastation in 3 years here in October 13, same location. A couple of years later, and essentially all the plants are dead. So it's a serious problem. And as you can imagine, it started over here in this region and it moved on elsewhere. And it's still moving north and expanding to other areas here. So it's about here now. So there are serious impacts of this disease, right? You have social problems, as you know, all these protests and neighbors fighting neighbors. Is Xylem real? Is this a serious problem or not? Should we do something? You also have an agricultural problem, which is, I tend to think, where we as plant pathologists come in more often, trying to help manage the problem. There's an economic, and the economy was affected. Tourism was affected. There are trees that are thousands of years old. People go to the region to see these trees. There are also issues with the landscape and the environment. It is the keystone species. It's the main species out there in the environment, and it's all dead now. And there are cultural and political issues as well, right? So culture, the flag of the region has an olive tree, for example. And trade is always important, particularly we're all aware of nursery trade, which is a very serious problem. So this region in southern Italy, because it's so warm, was still is a major region for producing nursery plants for export to the rest of Europe. And nursery trade was blocked. So there was a serious kind of problem there. But broadly speaking, there's also impacts on perceptions of science, right? What are the scientists doing? Why are they letting this happen? We don't know what's going on. And you know, this feeds into this broader narrative that science is bad, or we are all experts. We don't need scientists anymore because, you know, I read on Facebook last night that something is something, so I know more than the scientist does. So Xylem again was found here, this area, the heel of Europe, of Italy, in 2013. Then the Europeans had to start looking everywhere. And sure enough, everywhere they look, they find it. These are also old. Some of these in Spain, for example, and France are probably older introductions compared to the one in Italy. These are affecting different crops. Concerns for now is mostly almonds and olives. And there are also countries that are, of course, not reporting, where you have seen introductions. So we've been using a lot of genomics, and we've been able to trace some of these introductions. Most of the introductions into Europe that we know of all came from the United States, which makes sense because of trade of infected, contaminated plant material. And what we're seeing now is that history is repeating itself. So this is in Valencia, in Spain, as Xylem was observed there. You can see street protests. You can see conflict with the police. Here are removing trees is incredibly expensive. As you can see, is not something that you know, poor, low-income rural communities can do. And here you can see some sort of violence against these efforts. So here's a window that's broken in one of these tractors. Here are tires that were cut so that the tractor could not work. So this is happening elsewhere. It's not only limited to Italy, although most of the more serious problem, the more serious story is coming from Italy. Some of this is not as bad right now because people in Italy are there, because years have gone by now, they see with their own eyes how bad the problem is. And I think that being able to see it is actually helping minimize some of these other issues. So I've argued that we can look for help outside the natural sciences. So I think we're very good biologists. I think we're very good at epidemiology and disease modeling and all of those things. I think we're very bad in social sciences and the humanities. And just like understanding why are people not being vaccinated is not a question for a biologist. I think that understanding some of these issues are not questions for a biologist. But if we do not understand this, we cannot manage these diseases effectively, particularly epidemics and outbreaks. So a student who has another position in Italy now, Christian Colella, has done some work on this. And what he really made clear to everybody is that you have different players, you have different actors, and they're looking at different things. So the focus is different. So you have the European Commission, they are concerned about eradication. They're concerned about containment. They're concerned about surveys. They're concerned about containing the problem, eradicating it. The scientists are concerned about understanding what's going on, the disease dynamics, and how to control it, right? That's their concern. They're trying to inform, generate information. But then local groups, social groups, they're interested in other things. They're interested in economic issues. They're interested about traditional knowledge, how they have other diseases being managed. They think that there is a political role of experts. And the truth is we all have our own preferences for management decisions. We don't all necessarily agree on the specifics. And just like climate change, you have 1% of scientists who say, well, I'm not sure about climate change. And then, oh, there is a debate about climate change. There is no debate about climate change. But that can be argued in different ways. So one of the things that Christian did was very nice, is that he made very clear that there is this problem setting and problem solving kind of frameworks, and the problem, and that's different for these groups. So for European Union, the problem is the pathogen. It's a quarantine pathogen, and we have to get rid of it. It's a very, in some ways, that's their problem. That's how you solve it. For scientists, the pathogen is here. We need to understand the disease and how to manage it. And resistant cultivars is one example. But the social movement's a little bit different. Is the pathogen the sole cause of the disease? Could you have other microbes infecting plants? Could you have pollution, agricultural practices? Are there other components of the agricultural system that are important here? And the solutions in this particular disease system were not really linked to resistant cultivars or eradicating plants. The social movements were arguing that good agricultural practices, biofertilizers, other strategies were better and more effective. So there is a disconnect between these groups. And this is sort of how it plays out in the real world. So, and it comes back to some issues about science literacy. We all learn how to read, but I do wonder how prevalent it is and how it would impact people. So the epidemiologists watching this here, many plant pathologists know this map here about a cholera outbreak in London is the beginning of epidemiology, the way we know it today. There's a nice book that tells the story about Snow's, data and how he solved this epidemic, if that's how it was solved. But I want to ask you really quick, what was the last book you read about a plant disease? So just think really quick, what was the last book you read about a plant disease? Okay, all right. So I am going to go to the next slide, and I will argue not only that we don't have those books, I will argue that we should read more broadly, okay? I am saying that I think we're really good plant pathologists. I think all of you in this call, if you have to go tell a farmer how to manage the disease you work with, I think if the farmer did everything you told the farmer to do, you would have success. But we can't do that. We're failing somewhere. And I think we're failing because we're not reading broadly and thinking about the benefits of scientists who think about history, who think about social sciences, who think about psychology, and how we can interact in terms of plant diseases with people. Ultimately, we're talking about people and people managing problems, not diseases themselves. So here's another question here at the bottom. It's, name one professor or researcher from the social sciences or humanities, not a biologist or not an ecologist, in a plant pathology department, any plant pathology department, anywhere in the world. When you think of public health, they have psychologists, they have historians, they have social sciences for public health. Why is it that we don't have it for plant pathology? So we think we're looking at disease systems, and I'm almost finished. I know I have 1 minute here. We think about diseases looking from this photograph, okay? I think of Xylem diseases, and I'm like, I know everything. I know the insect, I know the plant, I know the abiotic system, components of the system, I know the pathogen. And I think that we all think this is our plant disease. And when we think about, we go home or we go to the field, we're thinking about this. We give a talk to farmers. That's what we're thinking about. I think that this is what we're talking about. I think we're talking about one or two of these components of this system. I think that there is a lot more to the system that is not biology. It's policy, is people, is economics, and other aspects. But we're not thinking about that. We're only thinking about plant pathogens, interactions, spread. And I think that that is a big failure and is something that I've been thinking a lot about because we're great at this. We're great at any one of these, but we're not making this look like this. And that's why we should consider the social sciences and humanities, these people who think about these other issues. So in general, this is how a plant pathology talk would look like, and we're talking about sick plants, and it's devastating, but we all love sick plants. We like them. But I don't think that that's what we're talking about. I think we're talking about people. I think these kids here, they're seeing the landscape being devastated and replaced with something completely different. And I think that that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about cultures and economics and politics and landscape, but mostly people. And I think that that's a lost kind of component of these disease systems. So that's my take-home message, and I will finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo, for a very, very interesting talk. I have a few questions that I've received, and I'll probably make them in English too, so you can better understand.
I understand Spanish. It's just that my
Okay, then I'll ask them in Spanish. Okay. Muy interesante su perspectiva de los beneficios que acarrearía la inclusión de profesionales de las ciencias sociales y de las humanidades para abordar el contexto que implican las enfermedades emergentes. Y hay dos preguntas acá. ¿Cómo se imaginaría esa contribución? Mencionó, una es la inclusión de profesores en los departamentos, pero how would you envision that?
So, in the United States, we have a few programs. So this is a mechanism through funding, through research money that requires, for example, an economic component. There is an effort. So for example, if you're going to have a large research project, many groups, a large thing, you have to have an economist, for example, and there is more interest about having an outreach component and maybe having a social sciences component. So one way of making it work is forcing people, if you want to get money, you have to include these people. The other mechanism is through engaging with them academically. And one way of doing it is hiring them and having them work with plant diseases. So I think that there is a growing interest in environmental sciences in general, to understanding the social sciences, but in plant pathology in particular, because most of it is focused to crops and is also focused on yield, so increasing how much we produce. I think there is a disconnect from the environment itself. But I think that there is potential for engaging with social scientists in sort of these different mechanisms. One is give people a job. So they work with this, that's their job. And the other one is when you are sitting in Buenos Aires and trying to develop a call for grants, is to include a requirement for having those people involved. I'm sure there are other mechanisms, but these are two examples.
Y también relacionado con esto, la segunda parte de esta pregunta es si esta estrategia también sería válida para abordar y lograr la aceptación de algunas tecnologías emergentes, como ser ingeniería genética, edición génica, etc.
Yes, I think that, I think actually for ingeniería genética, I think that you already have efforts for transgenic plants for communicating with people and everything else. And it is, my understanding is much of the failure with transgenic plants, it was because the large companies were really pushing for it, and they failed at communicating. So I would say yes. I think it's sort of the same problem in the sense that it's a matter of educating people, but also I think we tend to, as professors, we think we are teaching people. In this case, I think we have to also listen to their concerns. Why are they concerned about it? What is driving it? And I think that we fail at that. I fail at that. I fail at listening. And I think listening, why are they concerned? How can we help them? I think that that's part of this process.
Una pregunta se refiere al tema de erradicación versus la parte legal. La experiencia con cancro cítrico en Florida, donde se hizo erradicación por varios años, incluso en viviendas particulares de plantas cítricas que mostraban cancro, y eso trajo muchas consecuencias legales para las autoridades del USDA y en los científicos involucrados. Esto tiende a desalentar el involucramiento de los científicos cuando se trata de estas enfermedades emergentes, y más cuando mostrando lo de Italia también, ¿no?
That's a very difficult question.
Porque
I am not sure I know how to answer it. I think that's an excellent question. I do believe we as scientists have to go out to the world and tell people what we think. And I think we have to tell them why we think that. And we have to be clear that our knowledge is limited. But I do remember when there were conspiracy theories that I was responsible for the problem in Italy, and it did not feel good. It felt very bad. Even though I knew everything was a lie, it still felt very bad, and it was difficult. So I don't know how to answer that question.
Ok. Acá nos mencionaban que recién que involucrando a los productores locales también puede ser parte de la solución. Involucrar a los productores.
Certainly, but in Italy, for example, some of the local farmers were very much part of the conspiracy theories, and some were not. But a lot of them did not want to cut trees. A lot of them did not believe it was a problem.
Una última pregunta rápida ya para ir cerrando, Rodrigo. El tema de cuál sería la más eficiente manera de manejar esta enfermedad en particular. Mencionabas variedades resistentes. ¿Existe otra manera?
So in this particular case, of course, vector suppression. So these insects, they live very long. You can till the soil. So spittle bugs in Italy, they grow in weeds. So you can manage the weeds and reduce vector populations. So reducing vector populations is key, and eliminating infected plants is also key. We already know that some varieties may be somewhat tolerant. So I think I do believe it can be managed, at least from a perspective of being sustainable, but it does require multiple strategies, and they are all a little bit long-term strategies.
Ok, bueno, Rodrigo, creo que hemos llegado al final de una excelente disertación y una muy buena contestación a las preguntas. Quiero agradecerte en nombre de la comisión organizadora del quinto Congreso Argentino de Fitopatología por tu participación, y será hasta una próxima oportunidad. Y también recordarles a los asistentes virtuales que pueden visitar la sala de póster con los trabajos científicos que se encuentran en display allí, también los stands y micrositios de las empresas auspiciantes en el hall comercial, que es muy importante para ellos, y por supuesto invitarlos a continuar participando en las otras charlas, y una vez que este congreso termine van a poder verlo en la plataforma y también en el canal de YouTube de la Asociación Argentina de Fitopatología. Así que, Rodrigo, muchísimas gracias nuevamente y muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes por la participación en esta sesión plenaria.